They gave my sister $560K for a house and called me a failure. 3 years later, they were broke, and I owned the land they begged me to sell. I remember the exact sound of my grandfather's watch when it stopped. Soft, mechanical, like a held breath released. It was the same sound that seemed to echo through the small funeral parlor the day the will was read. Faces blurred for me then. My mother's carefully arranged hair, my father's clenched jaw, Olivia's perfume. The lawyer sat between them like a pillar of impartiality. When he read the line that named me the heir to the 5-acre farmhouse, time split. That sentence was an amputation and a gift all at once. To our granddaughter, Blake, we leave our 5-acre property and farmhouse. My father's face went the color of rust. My mother's hands tightened into a set, deliberate fist. Olivia's eyes betrayed the exact expression she'd perfected since childhood, the one that said, "Without words, this shouldn't be happening." I felt it then, the electricity of their disbelief. It was delicious and painful. Delicious because I'd finally been recognized by the only people whose approval had ever mattered to me. Painful because the approval came from dead hands, not living ones. Afterward, in the cold hallway where the carpeting smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, my father cornered me like a man who had rehearsed 1,000 times but forgot his lines. "You need to sell that property," he said quietly. "It's not practical. You live in Brooklyn. You can't maintain it. We'll divide what we get fairly." "Fairly," he repeated. The word slid out of him with the same smugness he used to blame my choices. Dad had always believed the universe owed him neat arithmetic. His investments plus the right kind of children would equate to a tidy legacy and good marriages and confirmations. He expected numbers on spreadsheets. He didn't understand that some inheritances are weather and roots and apple trees and the way someone hummed while kneading dough. Dad didn't understand that value is not always liquid. Arithmetic. His investments plus the right kind of children would equate to a tidy legacy. It was the most useless sentence I'd ever given him and exactly what he wanted. He expected time to smooth the outrage into a paycheck. He didn't understand that when I drove upstate for the first time alone, and apple trees, the sky felt like it had been added to the world specifically to soften the edges of the farmhouse. The house was tired, paint peeling, porch sagging, the garden a footnote of tangled weeds, but every floorboard, every crooked shutter sang a memory. I run my fingers along the banister my grandfather carved. I could feel the grooves of his hands. The treehouse that had been my kingdom was still there, a little lower to the ground, a little warier, but a kingdom. The apple trees still bore fruit, stubborn and tart, and a brook cut a lazy line along the property's edge. I'm not going to romanticize those early months. They were brutal. I had studio bills in Brooklyn and a life of freelance unpredictability. I hadn't chosen the sensible path. I'd chosen art school, part-time gallery shows, and the terrifying freedom of uncertain income. My parents used the word failure like a coin to pay for their disappointment. They'd decided my life was a cautionary tale and treated me accordingly. But there's a kind of oxygen that comes from dirt under your nails, and work you can measure in rows of salad greens and the slow mending of a roof. It feeds something stubborn in you. So I stayed. I spent weekends there, helped by a neighbor named Warren, who'd always been reliable in a way adults rarely are. He taught me carpentry basics, how to coax life back into a brittle lawn, and how to graft an apple tree the way my grandfather had grafted saplings decades ago. Warren didn't ask why I'd left the property. He treated the land like an inheritance of skill. Shovel, sweat, repeat. He became the adult I needed when my parents were busy being disappointed. The first winter was a lesson in the arithmetic of survival. I learned how to winterize a drafty farmhouse, how to stoke a coal stove big enough to boil a pot and dry socks, and how to bake toasty loaves that filled the house with something like forgiveness. I lived cheaply. I traded city nights for crackling fires and made emergency runs to the hardware store in a sedan weighed down with nails and buckets. I learned to appreciate small economies. A harvested squash that becomes dinner for 3 nights. a bouquet of late roses that can sell for enough to pay for insulation. Meanwhile, the farmhouse became something else. Not just my refuge, but a place the community noticed. Folks who used to drive past started asking about the open days when I sold jars of preserves at the Saturday market. Tourists who loved rustic stays began to ask if they could come for a weekend. I scrawled prices on chalkboards and kept receipts in a tin, like evidence of an experiment. What began as a scrappy attempt to keep the property from going wild turned into steady income. People liked it. They liked the idea of staying in a house whose walls held stories. 2.5 years after the will reading, the first crack in the armor came in the voicemail I wasn't expecting. My sister called. Her voice was thin, the practiced warmth replaced by something raw and immediate. "Blake, it's Dad. It's bad. Business. You heard him when he was young. He made bad investments. The bank. Mom says they might lose the house." A cold thing uncoiled in me. There's a particular clarity that hits when someone who built a life on saying you won't suddenly say I can't. For years, they'd marketed me as the demonstration of imprudence, my student loans, my risk choices, the unstable artistic career. But the world is a scale. The people who weighed me as unbalanced had found themselves teetering. I didn't call back right away. I let the message sit while I pulled weeds that afternoon, because important decisions taste better with the grounding of chores. When I did return her call, I kept my voice steady. "I'm sorry, Liv. That sounds hard." We arranged to meet. They came up the next weekend like a small army of entitlement. My parents, Olivia, and Daniel, her new husband, who had a safe-eyed posture and a business card that said, Vice President. They stood in my garden like critics inspecting a production. My mother ran a judgmental hand over my patched curtains, as if the fabric itself had betrayed them. "We thought about it," my father said, and the first sentence was a soft, editorialized threat. "We thought it'd be best if you sold the land." "You sold everything you wanted already," my mother added, in that precise tone that meant she had scheduled an argument and found my life figured into a tidy spreadsheet. "You can't afford the taxes. Think of the bills. This isn't ideal, Blake." Olivia's eyes were wet but uncluttered. She looked like someone auditioning for the part of a suffering sibling. I don't know whether she wanted me to offer salvation or to climb on stage and perform the ritual of forgiveness. What I did instead was lead them down to the cellar. "You should see the new expansion," I said. "The guest rooms are nearly done." They found the 2 renovated rooms with their reclaimed wood and linen sheets, and a tiny handwritten sign. "The orchard rooms. By reservation only." They looked obligingly impressed. My father's jaw tightened. It had that look of a man whose ledger had an unexpected negative. "I met an investor," I told them. "A local group. We started a weekend guest stay and small events. I do farm-to-table dinners. It helps with the upkeep." My father's nostrils flared. "So you didn't sell anything?" The question that followed wasn't a question. "If you had the sense to sell, we could have used the money." I let it hang. I wanted them to feel the way I had. The small, irritable knowledge that the people who had once treated my choices like an embarrassment were now hopeful of taking from what I'd built. "Sell?" I repeated. "I did sell part of the property to investors who helped us build the farmstay, but your timing was off." My voice was quiet, controlled. "If you're asking me to equate my grandparents' home to a line item on your bankruptcy paperwork, I'm not interested." They hemmed and hawed. The grown people in the room looked like children who'd discovered the cookie jar empty because someone else had been invited to eat. 2 things happen in people who have been given everything. They assume they can always buy their way back into grace, and they assume other people's choices are commodities. I realized then that my revenge wouldn't be a single grand gesture. It would be a strategy composed of small humiliations, legal and elegant, that revealed the very thing their lives had been built on: fragile facades. I started planning. Not in the way you see in crime dramas. No malicious hacks, No threats, no ambushes. I planned the slow, legal squeeze. I learned the language of local zoning law and hospitality licensing. I learned how to make a balance sheet that told a story in black and white. I made my business credible. Good insurance, clean records, and a signed lease with the investor group. I put the whole thing up on a tidy site with testimonials and glowing photos. People began to post their weekend photos. The farmhouse developed a reputation for being restorative. We had a wait list. Father had been a man whose identity lived in the sheen of an image. Suits, dinners, the applause of meetings where men nodded in agreement. When that applause withdrew, he looked for a tangible purchase that would restore it. There's a particular cruelty to watching someone brittle crumble into the small humiliations of house payments overdue and polite phone calls to creditors. I watched him practice humility in voicemail messages, his voice wobbly. "Hello? This is Richard Hayes, please." And then always, "We'll figure something out." He called me once, voice smaller than a child's whisper, asking if I could help. "You?" I said into the phone. The irony was nearly audible. I had to keep my laughter as light and private as a cough. Later, when I saw their house foreclosure notice while doing my morning scroll through the local property alerts, I felt a satisfaction that shamed me a little to admit. But shame and satisfaction can coexist. There was no glee in wanting them homeless. There was only a justice that tasted like a dry, sharp apple. When the bank came in, they laughed into the lines of their faces that they were proud people, that they had made mistakes. Olivia called me one night in tears from a McDonald's parking lot while the courthouse processed a new arrangement. "Blake, Dad's calling people. He's thinking of reaching out to you." I let the call ring out for only a moment before answering. "Is this about your pride or your mortgage?" Her voice was small. "We don't have anywhere to go. Daniel's trying to get some help from his family." She trailed off. I could hear the weight behind the words. The life they'd built on certainty had creaked. This was the pivot point I had imagined, the power to change the narrative. Many people would have offered them sanctuary. Maybe I wanted to. But I also wanted the lesson to land like a stone in a still pond. When they came to my porch the next afternoon, breathless in jackets buttoned wrong and hands full of paper documents smelling faintly of desperation, I could see they'd practiced the posture of humility. It made them grotesque in a familiar way. The same people who once lectured me about being practical, now standing with hands extended, asking me to be their bailout. Dad spoke first, the practiced litany of excuses. "We had bad deals. I misread the market." He said it like a man reading lines. Mom kept interrupting to rearrange how the story might be better for them. Olivia stood by the back row, looking like someone who had been coached in emotional transparency. "We need help," my father said. "You could sell us part of the property. Help us out. We'll pay you back when things are better." He looked like a man who had lost the right to ask. I walked them through the garden, past the signs for the guest rooms, past the new hand-built benches with carved initials from our guests. I watched their faces shift as they took in the life I'd created. A life that had old wood and new bookings. Life that had people who signed their names and left notes about how they had slept for the first time in years. "Sell?" I said. "You asked me to sell when you thought I was foolish. You told me I needed to be reasonable, that you'd split the money. Now you're back because your suit has holes and your investments have failed. You want to come into the living room and tell me you need a piece of my life because yours collapsed. And you expect me to treat your request as ordinary?" "It's family," Olivia whispered, as if those words had any force. Family used to mean we took each other's burdens, but family also meant they'd used my life as an example for years. I wanted them to taste the dissonance. "I can help," I said slowly, "but help isn't a handout. Help has terms." My terms were simple and surgical. They were not vindictive in the petty way of a tantrum. They were theatrical in the way vengeance can be when someone who has been denied dignity, decides to test the boundaries of empathy. First, I offered them a cheap loan. Small, insulting, almost theatrical, $5,000. Enough to move things from immediate crisis to embarrassment. The check was precise. I walked it out to Dad and placed it in his palm like a costume piece returned. "You'll use it for fees," I said. "I'll even include—" I paused to be kind in the smallest way. A list of local resources with pro bono legal help. I smiled a little because cruelty dressed as kindness can be the most hurtful. They took the envelope. They thanked me with the flicker of relief that comes from someone who's been taught to accept a charity that comes with strings. It felt like a confession chamber. It felt like a verdict. Then I withdrew. I called an accountant. I arranged to have quarterly reports printed and available for public inspection at the next town council meeting. I notified the local papers about a sponsored community garden program I was launching and invited my parents to the ribbon cutting, as an act of contrition if they wished. I requested that local television come to film a segment about small businesses recovering during uncertain times. And I made sure the producer knew to schedule the segment for the morning show, where my parents' mortgage broker always watched the news. I turned my success into a glass house. I did it for everyone who had ever sat at a table where I was the cautionary tale. I did it for myself, because the people who had written me off had to sit in the audience while I read a report on revenue and job creation. It was legal. It was ethical. It was a theatrical lesson. The day of the ribbon cutting, I dressed plainly and smiled. The local reporter asked me the usual questions about inspiration and community. My father arrived late. He stood in the back, staggering in a way humility can make a man look. Small and uncertain. Olivia came holding a paper program with her name crookedly written on the volunteer list, during the community acknowledgement. I invited the bank representative to the stage. He spoke about how collaboration saves homes and local economies. He told a story about families pulling together. I nodded in agreement. Then I handed him a printed packet, the kind of transparent documents that make accountants salivate, our certified profit and loss, lease agreements, employment numbers, projected investments, bookings, and a list of collaborative partners who vouched for the business's viability. The camera panned. My parents were in the frame. My mother attempted the practiced smile she'd always used on gallery openings, but something in her face folded under the weight of the audience. It was a public place. People were there. I felt the old thrill of being visible and of being recognized for a life I'd built from scratch. After the speech, when folks came up to congratulate me, they thanked me for thinking of the town and for saving a historical property. A woman in a floral scarf gripped my hand and said, "Your grandparents would be so proud." Those words were like honey. My mother's hand twitched in response, and I felt a dizzy, small thing inside me. The relief that comes when justice is both private and witnessed. The morning show segment aired the next week. My father watched, I later learned, in a diner with a folded paper bag and a cup of coffee gone tepid. He called me the next day, his voice gone thin. The man who had once lectured me about being responsible, now asking if there was a way he could be involved. He wanted to volunteer. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the performance of redemption. I gave him a schedule: cleaning, sweeping, and odd jobs that need no skills but a willingness to be seen turning a labeled broom. He came. He showed up in a sweater 2 sizes too small, hands raw from awkward labor. I taught him how to chop kindling. I showed him where to stack the wood. He was clumsy at first, and one evening he cut himself on a splinter and swore. I pressed a bandage into his palm like a small mercy from a stranger. On the 37th day, he showed up with a binder, charts and figures scribbled in typeset neatness. "I thought about investing," he said, as if an idea could be currency. "I thought I could fix things." "You can sweep," I said. "You can mend fence posts. You can make discovery payments to the mortgage company. You can apologize where it counts." My terms were a slow curating of humility. I could have given them everything. I chose to make dignity earned. They took satisfaction in physically participating. They took pride in watering the herb bed and in filling mason jars with jam. They began to appear on our Instagram, a strange thing to watch. The people who had once defined my failures now sharing curated snapshots. They looked like extras in my own life, willing, deferential, awkward. The town liked the narrative, fallen parents who worked their way back, and a daughter who generously allowed their redemption. Revenge had arrived exactly where I wanted it to. It was quietly public. It was not humiliated by spectacle, but by exposure. Their economies, of social standing, of certainty, were restructured. It was worse for them than a shout in a crowded room. It was a slow, public reorientation. They had to accept labor they had once dismissed. They had to learn the names of people they'd treated as lesser. They had their reputations, a life of easy influence, redrawn in the margins and footnotes of town hall minutes. But the real twist came when a developer came calling. A man in a pressed suit and an almost empty smile visited with blueprints about a nearby highway artery that would have sliced through the edge of our town. He proposed a deal to buy land, develop townhouses, and promise easy money. The offer was seductive to a man who had already learned the arithmetic of panic. He thought he recognized an old route to repair. Buy low, flip quick, recover image. Dad wanted to sell. He wanted the cash. In the past, he would have sold us all out without a second thought. He came to me quietly.